It began with a single omission buried inside an updated royal document, one name quietly erased, while palace officials insisted nothing significant had changed. But when Duchess Sophie reportedly discovered why Prince Edward had suddenly vanished from the Counsellor of State conversations, even veteran courtiers were left shaken. Because this was never just a constitutional adjustment. It was personal. And according to insiders, it exposed a fracture inside the monarchy far deeper than the palace ever intended the public to see. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the change appeared almost invisible, buried beneath formal constitutional language and routine palace updates that few members of the public ever read closely. But inside royal circles, where every altered title and every missing name carries enormous meaning, the silence surrounding Prince Edward reportedly triggered immediate concern. For years, Edward had occupied a strange but respected position within the monarchy. He was never the loudest royal, never the most glamorous, never the figure demanding headlines or attention. Instead, he became known as the dependable younger brother who quietly carried out duty after duty while others brought scandal, chaos, and public embarrassment crashing into the institution. Which is why, according to palace insiders, Sophie immediately sensed something was deeply wrong when Edward's involvement in sensitive royal discussions suddenly began to shrink without explanation. Meetings he once attended reportedly continued without him. Constitutional conversations became smaller, tighter, more secretive. And while aides insisted there had been no formal exclusion, those close to the royal household allegedly noticed the shift almost immediately. Reports suggest the atmosphere around King Charles changed dramatically following the deterioration of his health. Since early 2024, the monarchy had already been navigating a period of uncertainty unlike anything seen in decades. Charles, once eager to shape a modern, streamlined monarchy, reportedly became increasingly cautious about who held influence around him as his illness intensified behind closed palace walls. According to various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, the king's inner circle began tightening access to sensitive state matters, fearful of instability during vulnerable moments. But what stunned many observers was not the palace's desire for caution. It was the choice of who appeared to be quietly pushed outward. Prince Andrew remained a lingering constitutional issue despite years of controversy hanging over his public image. While Edward the brother, long described as loyal, disciplined, and scandal-free, reportedly found himself drifting further from the center of operational trust. To many watching carefully, it simply did not make sense. Sophie, however, reportedly understood something others did not. This was not an administrative reshuffle. It was a message. And according to insiders whispering through royal media circles, she became increasingly unsettled as Edward's absence from key discussions grew impossible to ignore. Several commentators even described her demeanor during public engagements as noticeably colder around senior palace officials, though no direct explanation was ever publicly offered. Those familiar with the institution's rigid internal dynamics claim Sophie allegedly confronted senior aides privately, demanding clarity over why Edward's decades of loyalty suddenly appeared to count for so little during one of the monarchy's most fragile chapters. Yet the answers she reportedly received were vague, cautious, and wrapped in constitutional language that explained nothing while revealing everything. Behind the polished statements and carefully rehearsed appearances, rumors began spreading that Charles feared a future power imbalance inside the monarchy if too many senior royals retained influence during periods of uncertainty. And if those whispers were true, Edward may have become the victim of an increasingly defensive palace strategy focused less on loyalty and more on control. What made the situation even more painful, according to royal watchers, was Edward's silence throughout the entire ordeal. There were no leaks from his office. No public frustrations. No attempts to defend himself through interviews or allies in the press. The man many once viewed as the monarchy's quiet sentinel reportedly continued, carrying out engagements with the same restrained composure he had maintained for decades. But that silence only intensified speculation surrounding Sophie's growing unease, because insiders claim she tattooed something devastating about the monarchy that few royals are ever willing to say aloud, that loyalty inside the institution is often celebrated publicly while quietly feared behind closed doors. Media commentators increasingly described Edward's distancing as calculated, not accidental, suggesting the decision reflected deeper anxieties surrounding Charles's reign rather than any failure on Edward's part. And as constitutional experts began questioning why one of the monarchy's safest figures appeared increasingly sidelined while instability surrounded the crown from every direction, Sophie reportedly realized this controversy was no longer just about Edward's role. It was about what the monarchy had become during its most uncertain era in generations. But the deeper Sophie looked into Edward's disappearance from the royal equation, the clearer it became that this decision had been building behind closed doors for years. For decades, Prince Edward had played the role no one else in the royal family seemed willing to accept: the invisible loyalist. No scandals, no memoirs, no public tantrums. Yet somehow, he became the one quietly pushed aside when the monarchy entered its most fragile era. For years, Edward existed in the background of royal life like a figure almost designed to be overlooked. While headlines exploded around bitter interviews, collapsing trust, public accusations, and endless palace crises, he remained silent, unshaken. He carried out engagements without demanding applause, avoided public conflict even when the institution itself seemed to be tearing apart, and reportedly became one of the very few royals' senior aides could rely on not to create another disaster by morning. That was why the shift surrounding him felt so deeply unsettling to those watching the monarchy closely. Because in a family where chaos often dominated attention, Edward had built his entire identity around discipline and restraint. And according to insiders, Sophie understood better than anyone how much of Edward's life had been shaped by quiet sacrifice for the crown. Royal commentators often described Edward and Sophie as one of the monarchy's safest pair of hands. They were not glamorous revolutionaries reshaping the institution from the front pages. They were dependable figures who accepted the burdens of royal life without demanding constant validation. In return, during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, reports frequently suggested the late monarch placed enormous trust in Edward precisely because he lacked ambition for spectacle. He was seen as cautious, measured, and deeply respectful of constitutional tradition. Various interpretations from former palace staff even claim Elizabeth viewed Edward as someone who understood the difference between personal status and institutional survival, a distinction the monarchy had struggled to preserve during years of internal division. Which is why Sophie reportedly believed Edward had earned something greater as Charles's reign entered increasingly dangerous territory. As the king's health concerns reportedly intensified behind palace walls, many assumed Edward's role inside the institution would naturally grow stronger. According to those familiar with the dynamics of the royal household, Sophie allegedly believed Edward's decades of loyalty had positioned him perfectly to become one of the monarchy's stabilizing forces during a period of uncertainty. Instead, the opposite appeared to happen. Palace aides reportedly began limiting Edward's involvement in sensitive discussions. Shortly after Charles consolidated authority more tightly around his immediate circle, meetings became narrower, access became restricted, and while no public explanation was ever formally given, insiders whispering through royal media networks increasingly described Edward's distancing as deliberate rather than accidental. To Sophie, according to several commentators, the emotional wound was not simply constitutional, it was deeply personal. Because the man who had spent decades protecting the institution suddenly appeared to be treated as though his loyalty itself had become politically inconvenient. The contrast with Prince Harry only deepened the tension surrounding Edward's situation. One brother had publicly attacked the monarchy through interviews, documentaries, and memoirs that reportedly left deep scars inside the family. The other had remained almost painfully loyal through years of instability. Yet according to palace whispers, it was Edward who slowly found himself pushed further from the center of influence, while Harry's rebellion continued dominating royal calculations from afar. That contradiction fueled growing speculation among royal watchers that Charles feared creating what insiders allegedly called another power center within the firm. Edward's reliability, his respected reputation, and his close connection to Sophie reportedly made some within the palace increasingly cautious about how much constitutional influence he should retain during such a vulnerable chapter. And if those whispers carried even a fragment of truth, the implications were devastating. Because it suggested the monarchy was no longer rewarding loyalty as it once had. It was managing influence through fear of instability. For Sophie, that realization reportedly changed everything. Sources close to royal circles claim she began viewing Edward's exclusion not as a temporary adjustment, but as a betrayal of decades spent placing duty above personal ambition. The institution Edward had protected without complaint now seemed willing to quietly erase him from its most sensitive operations, while insisting nothing unusual had happened at all. And the more Sophie watched the silence surrounding the decision, the more convinced she reportedly became that something far larger was unfolding behind closed palace doors. Because in her eyes, this was never simply about Edward losing access to discussions or ceremonial authority. It was about what the monarchy had become under pressure, an institution increasingly driven by caution, control, and survival. And as whispers spread through royal corridors, Sophie reportedly uncovered something even more unsettling. The removal may not have been about Edward's capability at all. According to palace whispers, King Charles was no longer making decisions based purely on tradition. He was making them based on survival. And somewhere between his illness, public pressure, and growing instability inside the monarchy, Edward became collateral damage. As concerns surrounding the king's health reportedly intensified behind closed palace walls, the atmosphere inside the monarchy allegedly shifted from ceremonial confidence to quiet constitutional anxiety. What had once appeared to the public as a stable transition into Charles's reign slowly became, according to insiders, a deeply controlled operation focused on protecting the crown during moments of vulnerability. Reports suggest that during periods of medical treatment, conversations surrounding royal authority became increasingly sensitive. Not because the monarchy feared public collapse overnight, but because those closest to the institution allegedly understood how dangerous uncertainty could become once questions of constitutional power entered the equation. And according to several royal commentators, that fear began reshaping decisions in ways the public was never fully meant to notice. For generations, the role of Counsellor of State existed as a safeguard, a mechanism designed to ensure continuity if a monarch became temporarily unavailable due to illness, travel, or crisis. But insiders now whisper that Charles reportedly viewed the arrangement through a far more defensive lens as his reign entered turbulent territory. Sources close to palace operations claim the king became increasingly concerned about who could exercise royal authority during weakened periods, particularly while public scrutiny around the monarchy remained relentless. Every decision carried consequences. Every constitutional adjustment risked creating speculation about instability at the very top of the institution. And according to various interpretations circulating among royal media circles, Charles allegedly wanted tighter control over Counsellor of State powers precisely. Why? Because he feared losing control of the monarchy's public narrative during vulnerable moments. That fear, according to palace strategists, may have extended directly toward Edward himself. Not because Edward was viewed as reckless or disloyal, but because his reputation had become something far more complicated inside the institution. He was respected, trusted, quietly admired by both staff and sections of the public exhausted by years of royal scandal. And according to insiders, some advisors allegedly worried that Edward's popularity could gradually evolve into influence during periods when Charles's health left the monarchy appearing fragile. In ordinary circumstances, such loyalty might have been viewed as an asset. But during a reign increasingly shaped by uncertainty, reports suggest even harmless stability began looking politically dangerous to those focused on maintaining centralized control around the king. For Sophie, the emotional implications reportedly became impossible to ignore. The more she observed Edward's quiet exclusion from sensitive matters, the more she allegedly interpreted the move as deliberate containment rather than constitutional necessity. Royal inside. Dares claims she understood something chilling about the palace mindset during this period. Survival had overtaken sentiment. The monarchy was no longer operating through old assumptions of family loyalty and earned trust. It was operating through calculation, through caution, through fear of future instability. And according to commentators watching the situation closely, an atmosphere of growing paranoia surrounding succession optics had quietly taken hold behind the scenes. Every appearance, every title, every constitutional role reportedly became part of a broader effort to project absolute control, while minimizing the possibility of competing centers of influence emerging inside the institution. Some royal historians even drew comparisons to older eras of monarchy, when senior royals were strategically sidelined not because they posed direct threats, but because their mere presence complicated fragile balances of power. The tactics were rarely public, rarely dramatic. Instead, influence disappeared slowly through exclusion, silence, and carefully managed distance until the message became unmistakable. And according to several palace whispers, Edward may have recognized exactly what was happening long before the public ever noticed. Yet despite the growing speculation surrounding his role, he allegedly refused to retaliate publicly. No interviews surfaced. No allies leaked angry statements on his behalf. Those familiar with Edward's character claim he feared worsening tensions during one of the monarchy's most unstable chapters and chose silence over confrontation, even as the institution he had protected for decades appeared to push him further toward the margins. But that silence carried consequences of its own. Because while Edward reportedly absorbed the humiliation quietly, Sophie was allegedly reaching the limits of what she was willing to accept. The deeper she looked into the constitutional justifications surrounding Edward's exclusion, the more convinced she reportedly became that this was never simply about protecting the crown during illness. It was about controlling the future shape of power inside the monarchy itself. And once that realization settled in, according to insiders, the emotional fracture inside the royal household grew impossible to contain behind polite appearances and formal statements any longer. But while Edward remained silent, Sophie reportedly reached a breaking point, and insiders claim that's when the real confrontation began. Those familiar with palace operations claim Sophie stopped behaving like a passive royal the moment she realized Edward's exclusion had become permanent. Behind the scenes, the Duchess, who once avoided conflict, reportedly began demanding answers few dared to ask the king himself. For years, Sophie had carefully built a reputation inside the monarchy as someone dependable, diplomatic, and remarkably disciplined in a royal system fueled by hierarchy and silence. She was not known for rebellion. She did not leak frustrations into newspapers or wage emotional battles through carefully timed interviews. Instead, she quietly adapted to the institution's rigid expectations, supporting Edward through decades of service while rarely drawing attention to herself. But according to palace insiders, something inside her reportedly shifted the moment she realized Edward's distancing was no longer temporary. What initially appeared to be a cautious constitutional adjustment slowly revealed itself as something colder and far more permanent. And once Sophie understood that, reports suggest she stopped accepting vague explanations from the palace machine designed to bury uncomfortable truths beneath ceremonial language. Those familiar with private royal operations claim Sophie allegedly began challenging senior advisors directly during behind-the-scenes discussions that quickly grew tense. Sources whisper that she repeatedly questioned why loyalty now appeared to be treated as a liability rather than a virtue. According to several media commentators, the emotional contradiction surrounding Edward's treatment had become impossible for her to ignore. Here was a man who had spent decades protecting the monarchy from embarrassment, quietly absorbing responsibility, while others detonated public crises around the institution. Yet when the monarchy entered one of the most unstable chapters in modern royal history, Edward reportedly became the figure quietly removed from meaningful influence. Sophie, according to insiders, no longer viewed that as coincidence. She viewed it as punishment. Palace staff reportedly noticed the atmosphere changing during private gatherings involving senior members of the royal household. What had once been polite restraint allegedly became strained silence. Several insiders described an uncomfortable tension surrounding conversations about constitutional authority, succession planning, and the narrowing circle around Charles during periods of illness. Sophie reportedly refused to accept the carefully rehearsed justifications repeatedly offered by palace officials. In her eyes, according to commentators familiar with the situation, Edward deserved protection from what increasingly looked like constitutional humiliation disguised as institutional necessity. And the more the palace attempted to frame the situation as routine procedure, the more determined Sophie allegedly became to expose the deeper motivations hiding beneath it. At the center of her frustration, insiders claim, was Charles's increasingly insulated inner circle. Royal media figures began quietly speculating that the king's advisors had become obsessed with controlling every aspect of the monarchy's public image during a time of enormous uncertainty. Sophie reportedly saw those advisors not as protectors of the institution, but as architects of Edward's isolation. According to sources familiar with the royal household, she allegedly grew increasingly frustrated. Teaching unelected palace strategists shape constitutional decisions while Edward remained silent to preserve family unity. That silence, however, only deepened the emotional divide between Sophie and the institution she had spent years supporting without complaint. Reports suggest Edward repeatedly urged restraint behind closed doors, fearful that open confrontation would only worsen tensions around Charles during an already fragile period. Those close to Edward describe him as deeply uncomfortable with conflict, particularly when the monarchy itself appeared vulnerable. But Sophie reportedly reached a point where silence no longer felt honorable, it felt destructive. Royal commentators began describing her transformation as unexpected but fierce, noting how the Duchess, who once seemed content operating quietly beside Edward, was suddenly emerging as one of the only figures willing to question the palace narrative openly within royal circles. And according to various interpretations from insiders, her growing determination was fueled by a fear far greater than temporary exclusion. Because beneath the constitutional arguments and controlled palace statements, speculation was growing. That Edward's royal future itself was slowly being erased. Not publicly, not dramatically, but carefully, strategically, and almost invisibly through exclusion from influence, shrinking authority, and controlled distance from the monarchy's operational core. Sophie reportedly understood exactly what that meant. Once a royal is quietly removed from the center of institutional trust, restoring that position becomes nearly impossible. And for someone who believed Edward had sacrificed decades of personal ambition in service of the crown, the emotional betrayal reportedly became unbearable. Yet the most explosive revelation wasn't Sophie's anger. It was the alleged reason palace insiders say Charles truly no longer trusted the arrangement. Insiders now whisper that Charles's decision had less to do with Edward personally, and far more to do with controlling the monarchy's future during an era of instability. And if those claims are true, the removal was never constitutional housekeeping, it was a calculated act of royal preservation. By the time Sophie reportedly began connecting the pieces behind Edward's quiet exclusion, the emotional conflict had already evolved into something far larger. Even then, a family disagreement. According to palace whispers circulating through royal media circles, Charles's inner operation had become consumed by one overriding fear: the possibility of fragmented authority during a period when the monarchy itself appeared vulnerable. Sources claim the king increasingly worried about too many senior royals holding constitutional influence simultaneously while his health remained under relentless public scrutiny. In ordinary times, the distribution of ceremonial responsibility might have seemed harmless, even stabilizing. But insiders suggest Charles no longer viewed the situation through the lens of tradition. He viewed it through the lens of control. Reports indicate that concerns surrounding royal authority intensified dramatically during periods connected to the king's medical treatment. Every constitutional safeguard, every delegated responsibility, every senior royal with proximity to institutional power reportedly became part of a broader calculation about optics, succession, and stability. Palace strategists allegedly feared that even temporary uncertainty surrounding Charles's condition could create dangerous speculation about who truly guided the monarchy behind closed doors. And according to commentators familiar with the inner workings of the institution, advisors began pushing for a far narrower circle of operational control around the crown itself. What had once been shared responsibility slowly transformed into tightly managed authority concentrated around a shrinking group of trusted figures. That shift, according to several insiders, placed Edward in an unexpectedly dangerous position not because he posed any active threat, but because of what he symbolized. For decades, Edward's reputation had been built on discipline, restraint, and loyalty. He was the brother who stayed. The royal who never publicly rebelled, never monetized family conflict, never weaponized private grievances against the institution. Ironically, Palace whispers now suggest those exact qualities may have made him politically uncomfortable to some inside Charles's orbit. Edward's calm reputation reportedly carried weight within both palace staff and sections of the public increasingly exhausted by years of royal instability. And according to sources close to the monarchy, certain advisors allegedly worried that such quiet credibility would evolve into influence during periods when the crown appeared fragile. For Sophie, the realization reportedly landed like a betrayal hidden beneath layers of constitutional language. Because once she began understanding the logic behind Edward's distancing, she allegedly saw something devastating about the modern monarchy itself. Loyalty, in her view, was no longer the institution's highest currency. Control was. Reports suggest Sophie came to believe Edward was not being excluded because he had failed the monarchy, but because he represented a version of royal duty that no longer fit the palace's increasingly defensive strategy. In a system consumed by fear of instability, even harmless loyalty could become politically threatening if it existed outside tightly controlled structures of influence. Royal commentators began openly speculating that Charles feared future divisions inside the institution if authority became too distributed among respected senior royals during uncertain times. Some insiders even described a growing obsession within palace circles surrounding succession optics, public perception, and internal hierarchy. The monarchy, according to those interpretations, was no longer simply protecting itself from external scandal. It was protecting itself from internal ambiguity. And in that atmosphere, Edward's quiet dignity reportedly became less reassuring to strategists and more unpredictable. Not because Edward himself sought power, but because others trusted him enough that influence could naturally gather around him during moments of institutional weakness. Comparisons soon emerged between Charles's approach and the far more balanced methods often associated with Queen Elizabeth II. The late monarch, despite navigating decades of crises, navigated the challenges of the late 20th century, reportedly maintained a broader sense of familial equilibrium within the institution, carefully balancing loyalty, hierarchy, and duty without appearing openly threatened by trusted senior royals. Charles, however, according to critics and commentators, increasingly appeared consumed by the pressure of protecting a monarchy under siege from illness, scandal, and public uncertainty. Sophie allegedly saw that difference clearly. To her, Edward was not being protected from constitutional complications. He was being sacrificed for optics. And that realization changed everything. Because once Sophie began viewing Edward's exclusion as part of a larger strategy to consolidate influence around the crown, the emotional damage became impossible to dismiss as routine palace management. The institution Edward had defended quietly for decades now appeared willing to erase him from meaningful authority in order to preserve the appearance of absolute control during turbulent times. But once the public began noticing Edward's absence more clearly, the palace faced a problem it could no longer quietly contain. What palace officials may have expected to disappear quietly instead triggered a wave of uncomfortable questions. Because outside the royal walls, many people began asking the same thing Sophie reportedly had from the beginning. Why remove one of the monarchy's most loyal figures during its most unstable chapter? At first, the palace reportedly believed the controversy would remain confined to constitutional experts, royal insiders, and the narrow circles that obsessively track every procedural shift inside the monarchy. But something unexpected began happening. The more Edward quietly disappeared from sensitive royal visibility, the more ordinary royal supporters started noticing the silence surrounding him. Public conversations that once focused almost entirely on scandals, memoirs, and fractured family relationships slowly turned toward a different question entirely. Why was one of the monarchy's least controversial figures suddenly being treated like an afterthought during one of the institution's most fragile eras? And once that question entered public discussion, according to insiders, palace officials reportedly struggled to contain the emotional fallout that followed. Royal fans increasingly expressed sympathy toward both Edward and Sophie, particularly as commentators revisited decades of their service to the crown. Unlike other figures who dominated headlines through conflict and public drama, Edward and Sophie had carefully built reputations around duty, consistency, and restraint. They represented a version of monarchy many supporters still believed in: quiet loyalty without spectacle. That contrast made Edward's apparent exclusion feel emotionally jarring to many observers. Reports suggest social discussions and royal commentary began framing Edward less as a sidelined prince and more as a symbol of a monarchy no longer rewarding the very values it once claimed, meant to protect. And for palace strategists already battling instability surrounding Charles's reign, that perception reportedly created a dangerous new problem. Commentators across royal media circles began openly questioning the optics of sidelining trusted royals, while controversies connected to other members of the family continued lingering over the institution. Comparisons between Edward's treatment and Prince Andrew's long-shadowed public controversies became impossible to ignore. According to several commentators, the emotional contradiction struck people deeply. One royal spent years quietly supporting the institution with almost no public scandal attached to his name, while another remained permanently associated with reputational damage that the monarchy could never fully escape. Yet somehow, insiders whispered, it was Edward who appeared increasingly distanced from constitutional importance. That contradiction fueled growing public suspicion that the palace's decisions were being shaped less by fairness and more by internal political calculation. As media discussions intensified, constitutional transparency itself became a growing topic of debate. Royal analysts reported. LY began questioning whether the monarchy's internal restructuring during Charles's illness was being communicated honestly to the public at all. Palace aides, according to insiders, found themselves increasingly cornered by speculation they could neither fully deny nor clearly explain without exposing deeper tensions inside the institution. Every carefully worded statement seemed only to deepen public curiosity, and while the palace attempted to maintain the appearance of stability, the growing silence surrounding Edward reportedly became louder than any official explanation. In the middle of that emotional storm, Sophie's role unexpectedly transformed in the eyes of many royal watchers. Reports suggest she became increasingly admired not because she publicly rebelled against the monarchy, but because she appeared willing to defend Edward's dignity, while others remained silent. Royal commentators described her as emotionally resolute, a figure unwilling to quietly accept what many perceived as the institutional erasure of her husband's decades of service. That admiration reportedly frustrated certain palace insiders even further, because Sophie's growing public sympathy risked forcing the exact fear strategists had allegedly been trying to avoid from the beginning: the emergence of another respected center of influence within the monarchy. Meanwhile, Charles himself increasingly appeared isolated inside his own reign. According to various interpretations from royal commentators, the king's efforts to project stability during periods of illness may have unintentionally deepened perceptions of emotional distance within the family. What palace officials reportedly framed as necessary constitutional management now looked, to many observers, like a monarchy quietly sacrificing one of its most loyal figures to preserve control during uncertain times. And the more the public reflected on Edward's years of disciplined silence compared to the chaos surrounding other royal controversies, the more perception shifted decisively in his favor. By this stage, the controversy no longer revolved solely around constitutional procedure. It had become symbolic of something far more unsettling about the institution itself. To many watching closely, Edward appeared less like a prince stepping back from responsibility and more like a man slowly edged aside by a monarchy increased, singly consumed by caution, optics, and survival. And as pressure mounted around the palace, Sophie reportedly came to a devastating realization about what this entire episode truly revealed about the monarchy's future. For Sophie, insiders claim the heartbreak was never simply about titles or constitutional procedure. It was about watching decades of silent loyalty suddenly become disposable the moment the monarchy felt threatened from within. By the time the controversy surrounding Edward's quiet exclusion had spread beyond palace corridors and into public discussion, Sophie reportedly understood something painful that few members of the royal family ever openly admit. The institution she had spent years protecting was changing. Not dramatically or publicly, but slowly, almost invisibly, through fear, caution, and survival instincts that now seemed to shape every major decision behind closed doors. According to insiders, Sophie no longer viewed Edward's removal as an isolated constitutional adjustment. She allegedly saw it as symbolic of a monarchy drifting away from the values it once claimed defined royal duty itself. Loyalty, restraint, patience, qualities Edward embodied for death. Decades appeared increasingly secondary to optics, control, and political calculation. For much of his life, Edward had existed in sharp contrast to the chaos that repeatedly consumed the monarchy. While public battles fractured family relationships and headlines became dominated by scandal, interviews, and accusations, Edward remained almost painfully discreet. He did not seek revenge through memoirs. He did not weaponize private frustrations against the institution. According to those close to royal operations, he quietly accepted responsibilities that brought little public praise while continuing to defend the monarchy during some of its darkest moments. Yet insiders now whisper that the very discretion which once made Edward valuable had become politically inconvenient inside a palace consumed by managing instability. Sophie reportedly struggled deeply with that contradiction, because from her perspective, the monarchy seemed to be rewarding noise while quietly discarding silence. Reports suggest the emotional toll on Sophie became increasingly difficult to hide behind formal appearances and carefully managed public composure. According to royal commentators, the pain was not mine. Rely private disappointment, it was humiliation. Watching Edward gradually pushed further from constitutional importance reportedly felt, to Sophie, like witnessing the erasure of an entire lifetime devoted to duty. And perhaps what hurt most was the way it happened. No public confrontation, no direct accusation. Just slow exclusion wrapped in polite language until the message became impossible to deny. Several insiders claim Sophie found that process emotionally devastating precisely because it lacked honesty. Everything remained outwardly civil while the reality beneath the surface reportedly grew colder by the day. At the center of it all stood Charles, increasingly portrayed by commentators as a monarch trapped between personal loyalty and institutional fear. Some insiders insist the king never intended to wound Edward personally. Others argue he became overwhelmed by the pressure of protecting a fragile monarchy during periods of illness, public uncertainty, and relentless scrutiny surrounding the future of the crown. But according to palace whispers, those pressures gradually transformed Charles's decision-making into something more defensive and isolated. The monarchy, in the eyes of many observers, no longer appeared guided by confidence. It appeared guided by anxiety over survival. Royal historians soon began drawing comparisons to earlier periods of internal fracture within the monarchy. Moments when fear of instability led senior royals to quietly sideline figures once considered trusted pillars of the institution. The methods, they argued, rarely changed. Influence was not always destroyed publicly. Sometimes it simply faded through managed distance, restricted access, and silent restructuring until a royal who once stood near the center of power found themselves standing outside it altogether. Those comparisons reportedly disturbed Sophie deeply, because they reinforced her growing belief that Edward's situation reflected something much larger than a temporary constitutional disagreement. It reflected a monarchy increasingly consumed by internal political management. As speculation intensified, another uncomfortable question began surfacing more frequently among commentators and royal observers alike. Who truly shapes the strategy of the modern monarchy now? Was Charles fully steering these decisions himself, or had palace advisors become the dominant inant force behind the crown during vulnerable periods? According to insiders, Sophie reportedly began emotionally distancing herself from the inner political machinery surrounding the institution because she no longer trusted the motivations driving it. The loyalty she once believed bound the family together now appeared fragile, conditional, and vulnerable to fear the moment stability came under threat. And perhaps that was the most devastating realization of all. Because beneath the constitutional debates and carefully rehearsed palace statements, Sophie allegedly came to believe that the monarchy no longer feared scandal as much as it feared losing control. Edward's silence, once treated as strength, had become something exploitable inside a system increasingly shaped by preservation rather than principle. But in the silence that followed, one final truth reportedly became impossible for Sophie and the public to ignore. In the end, Prince Edward never publicly fought back. No interviews, no accusations, no rebellion. And perhaps that silence became the most devastating part of all. Because while others exploded against the monarchy, Edward simply disappeared quietly from the center. Netter of it, and Sophie reportedly knew exactly why. As the controversy surrounding Edward's exclusion slowly settled into the background of royal life, one reality continued haunting those who had followed the story closely. Edward never defended himself publicly. He never attempted to expose palace frustrations through carefully timed leaks or emotional television appearances. There were no explosive memoirs waiting to settle scores. No public demands for sympathy. Instead, according to those familiar with the monarchy's inner world, Edward continued carrying himself with the same restrained discipline that had defined nearly his entire life inside the institution. And for many royal observers, that silence became impossible to ignore. Because in an era where anger had become profitable and betrayal often generated headlines, Edward reportedly chose loyalty even when loyalty no longer appeared to protect him in return. Sophie, according to insiders, understood the reason for that silence better than anyone. Reports suggest she believed the palace had quietly relied on one painful certainty throughout the entire ordeal, that Edward would never retaliate against the crown no matter how deeply wounded he became. That belief, according to commentators, may have made his exclusion easier to manage behind closed doors. Edward was not seen as a destabilizing force. He would not ignite public warfare against the institution. He would absorb the emotional damage privately if necessary, because duty had been ingrained into him for decades. And perhaps that realization became one of the most heartbreaking parts of the entire controversy for Sophie herself. The monarchy allegedly counted on Edward's silence precisely because it knew he would place the institution above his own humiliation. At the same time, Charles's reign increasingly came to be viewed through the lens of caution, containment, and controlled authority. Royal commentators began describing a monarchy shaped not by confidence but by fear of instability during a period of enormous uncertainty surrounding the future of the crown. According to palace whispers, decisions once guided by trust and family equilibrium now appeared driven by political survival and tightly managed optics. For many observers, Edward's quiet removal from meaningful constitutional visibility became symbolic of that transformation. It was no longer seen as a technical adjustment buried in royal procedure. It became a reflection of a monarchy struggling to protect itself while simultaneously weakening the very relationships that once gave it stability. Public sympathy for Edward and Sophie only continued growing as more people reflected on the contrast between Edward's conduct and the chaos that had surrounded other royal controversies in recent years. Royal supporters increasingly viewed the couple not as ambitious figures fighting for influence, but as loyal servants of the institution who had quietly endured emotional isolation without complaint. Sophie, in particular, reportedly emerged from the controversy with greater respect among many royal watchers, because she appeared willing to stand beside Edward even as the palace distanced itself from him. Commentators described her not as rebellious, but resolute, a woman who recognized the emotional cost of silence while refusing to abandon the person at the center of it. Meanwhile, the Counsellor of State controversy itself evolved into something much larger than a constitutional debate. Royal analysts increasingly framed it as a warning sign about the deeper instability inside the modern monarchy. Questions surrounding influence, succession optics, institutional control, and internal trust all converged around Edward's exclusion until the situation became symbolic of a crown struggling to balance survival with loyalty. According to various interpretations, the monarchy's greatest fear was never scandal alone. It was uncertainty. And in its effort to eliminate uncertainty, some believe the institution may have quietly sacrificed one of the few figures who still represented calm, dependable continuity. For Sophie, however, the emotional truth reportedly remained painfully simple beneath all the political calculations. Edward had given decades of his life to protecting the monarchy without demanding recognition in return. Yet when pressure closed in around the institution, loyalty alone no longer guaranteed security. That realization changed how many people viewed not only Charles's reign, but the monarchy itself. Because if someone as disciplined and restrained as Edward could slowly disappear from the center of royal trust, then perhaps the institution's internal fractures were far deeper than the public had ever been allowed to see. And in silence Edward chose to maintain until the very end. Many royal observers claim the monarchy revealed something about itself more powerful than any public scandal ever could. Not through shouting, not through rebellion, but through absence. Through the quiet removal of a man who spent most of his life believing service would always matter inside the crown. Because behind the glittering ceremonies and carefully scripted appearances, Sophie reportedly discovered a painful reality few royals ever admit aloud, that inside the monarchy, loyalty is treasured until it becomes inconvenient. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.